There are children right now who are learning one of the most damaging lessons a young brain can internalize, that their emotions are burdens, inconveniences, or weapons that will be used against them. They're 5, 7, 10 years old, and they're already shutting down emotionally, already learning to smile when they're hurting, already perfecting the art of saying, "I'm fine," when they're falling apart inside. And if you think this is just kids learning self-control or emotional regulation, the developmental neuroscience reveals something far more disturbing. When a child learns early that expressing feelings is dangerous, their developing brain rewires itself around emotional suppression, creating adults who are strangers to their own inner world. Today, we're exploring why some children close off emotionally before they've barely begun to develop. And the research shows this isn't maturity. It's trauma that looks like composure. Let me start with research that identifies the critical period when emotional shutdown typically occurs. A 2020 longitudinal study published in Developmental Psychology followed over 1,200 children from ages 4 through 12, tracking their emotional expression patterns and family dynamics. They found that children who would become emotionally suppressed as adults showed a distinct developmental trajectory. At ages 4 and 5, these children expressed emotions normally, crying when hurt, showing anger when frustrated, expressing joy openly. But between ages 6 and 9, something shifted. Their emotional expression dramatically decreased. By age 10, they showed what researchers called premature emotional flatness, expressing significantly fewer emotions than developmentally typical peers. They'd learned during a critical window of emotional development that feelings were better kept hidden. And once that pattern established during this developmental period, it became remarkably resistant to change. Before we go deeper, you need to understand what's supposed to happen during childhood emotional development. Research published in 2019 in Nature Neuroscience examined the neural architecture of emotional development in children. The limbic system, which generates emotional responses, is fully functional from birth. But the prefrontal cortex, which regulates and contextualizes emotions, develops slowly throughout childhood and adolescence. During healthy development, children learn emotional regulation through a process called co-regulation. The child experiences an emotion, expresses it, and the caregiver helps them understand and manage it through validation, comfort, and teaching. Over thousands of repetitions, the child's brain internalizes this process, developing neural pathways that connect emotional experience with healthy expression and regulation. The prefrontal cortex essentially learns from the caregiver how to relate to limbic emotional responses. But when caregivers consistently respond to emotional expression with invalidation, punishment, dismissal, or using the emotion against the child, something different happens. The child's brain still needs to develop emotional regulation, but instead of learning healthy regulation, it learns suppression. The developing prefrontal cortex gets trained not to understand and contextualize emotions, but to silence and hide them. The neural architecture that should support emotional intelligence instead supports emotional disconnection. Now, let's talk about the specific parental responses that teach children to stop sharing feelings. A groundbreaking 2018 study published in Child Development identified what researchers called emotion-dismissive parenting patterns. They videotaped thousands of parent-child interactions during moments of child emotional expression and coded parental responses. Several patterns predicted later emotional suppression in children. The first was direct invalidation. "You're not really upset. That's not a big deal. You're being too sensitive. Stop overreacting." The child expresses a genuine emotional experience, and the parent denies its validity. The child's brain receives a confusing message. What I'm feeling inside doesn't match what I'm allowed to feel. Over repeated experiences, the child learns not to trust their own emotional experience. If parents, the supposed experts on reality, say you're not feeling what you're feeling, maybe you're wrong about your own internal states. The second pattern was punishment or anger in response to emotion. "Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Go to your room until you can control yourself. I don't want to hear it," delivered with visible frustration or anger. The child learns that emotional expression makes the parent angry and threatens the attachment relationship. Since attachment is survival for a child, the brain makes a calculation: suppress emotion to maintain attachment. The emotion becomes associated with danger to the primary relationship. The third pattern was emotional contagion without boundaries, where the parent became overwhelmed or distressed by the child's emotion. "You're stressing me out. I can't handle this right now. Your emotions are too much for me." The child learns that their feelings burden the parent and threaten the parent's well-being. They develop what researchers called emotional caretaking, where the child suppresses their own emotions to protect the parent's emotional state. The child becomes the emotional regulator for the parent, sacrificing their own emotional expression. The fourth pattern was weaponization, where emotions expressed by the child were later used against them, bringing up past emotional expressions during arguments, mocking the child for having cried, using disclosed feelings as ammunition, or sharing the child's vulnerable moments with others in ways that humiliated the child. The child learns that emotional disclosure creates evidence that will be used to hurt them. Emotions become dangerous secrets better kept hidden. Let's examine the neuroscience of what happens when a child's emotional expression is consistently met with these responses. A 2021 study published in Biological Psychiatry used neuroimaging to examine children at high risk for emotional suppression due to invalidating home environments. They found measurable differences in brain development compared to children in emotionally responsive homes. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in emotional awareness and expression, showed reduced activity during emotional tasks. The insula, which processes internal emotional states, showed diminished connectivity with other brain regions. The prefrontal cortex showed heightened activity during emotional expression, suggesting active suppression rather than natural regulation. Their brains were developing neural pathways that prioritized emotional hiding over emotional processing. Most concerning was altered development in the limbic system itself. While emotional generation capacity remained intact, the pathways connecting limbic emotional responses to conscious awareness and verbal expression were being pruned away through disuse. The child could still feel emotions neurologically, but the connections that would allow them to recognize, understand, and communicate those emotions were weakening. They were becoming neurologically disconnected from their own emotional experience. Research on attachment theory provides crucial context. A 2019 study published in Attachment and Human Development examined how early emotional suppression related to attachment patterns. Children who learned early to suppress emotions overwhelmingly developed insecure attachment, particularly avoidant attachment. They learned that emotions threatened attachment security, so they minimized emotional expression and needs to maintain connection with caregivers. Brain imaging showed that when these children experienced attachment distress, their amygdala activated normally, indicating they were experiencing the fear and need typical of attachment distress. But the neural pathways that would typically trigger attachment-seeking behavior, crying, reaching for the caregiver, were inhibited. The children had learned to suffer attachment distress silently, to need without asking, to hurt without showing. This pattern, established in early childhood, became a template for all future relationships. Let's talk about the role of gender in early emotional shutdown. A 2020 study published in Sex Roles examined how gender socialization affected emotional expression in children. They found that boys received significantly more emotion-dismissive parenting than girls, particularly around emotions coded as vulnerable, like sadness, fear, or hurt. Boys received messages like, "Big boys don't cry," "Toughen up," "Don't be a baby," starting as young as age 3. By age 7, boys in the study were expressing significantly less vulnerable emotion than girls, even though physiological measurements showed they were experiencing emotions at similar intensities. Their emotional suppression wasn't absence of feeling, it was learned performance of stoicism. Brain imaging showed that boys engaging in emotional suppression showed heightened prefrontal activation, indicating active cognitive effort to inhibit emotional expression. They were working hard to not show what they felt. But the study also found that girls received emotion-dismissive parenting around anger and assertion. Girls expressing anger were more likely to be told they were being difficult, mean, or unladylike. By age 8, girls were expressing significantly less anger than boys, even though underlying frustration and assertive impulses were similar. Both genders were learning to suppress, just different emotions based on gendered expectations of acceptable expression. Research on sibling dynamics reveals another pathway to early emotional shutdown. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Family Psychology found that children who had siblings with higher needs, whether due to disability, illness, behavioral problems, or being the favorite, often learned early emotional suppression. These children observed that parental attention was limited and directed primarily to the sibling with greater needs. Their developing brain made an adaptive calculation. To avoid burdening already stretched parents, minimize your own needs and emotions. These children became what researchers called invisible children, suppressing their emotional experiences to avoid adding to family stress. They'd learned before age 10 that their role was to be low maintenance, undemanding, emotionally self-sufficient. The suppression wasn't about their emotions being punished. It was about preemptively managing scarcity of parental emotional resources. Now, let's examine what happens inside a child's mind during the process of learning to suppress emotions. A 2020 qualitative study published in the Journal of Child and Family Studies interviewed adults about their memories of when they stopped sharing feelings as children. Participants described a process of repeated testing and learning. They'd express an emotion, experience an invalidating or punishing response, feel hurt or confused, and try again, hoping for different outcome. After enough repetitions where emotional expression led to negative outcomes, something shifted. Participants described making a conscious or semi-conscious decision. I learned not to tell them anything. I realized I was on my own. I stopped expecting them to understand or care. But what felt like a conscious choice was actually the child's brain completing a learning process. Emotional expression equals danger or futility, therefore suppress emotional expression. Participants described developing elaborate strategies for hiding emotions, going to their room to cry alone, waiting until parents were gone to express feelings, creating personas of being fine, while privately experiencing intense emotions, learning to change the subject when feelings arose in conversation. These strategies, developed in childhood, became automatic patterns that persisted decades into adulthood. Let's talk about the specific types of emotions children learn to suppress. A 2021 study published in Emotion examined which emotions children were most likely to hide based on family patterns. Sadness was the most commonly suppressed emotion, particularly in families that valued positivity, strength, or not dwelling on negative things. Children learned that sadness made others uncomfortable, and they learned to perform happiness while privately experiencing depression. Fear and anxiety were highly suppressed in families that valued bravery, independence, or criticized children for being scaredy cats or clingy. Children learned that fear made them appear weak or babyish, so they hid terror behind false courage. The study found that many adult anxiety disorders had roots in childhood, where the child experienced legitimate fears that were dismissed or mocked, leading them to suppress fear responses that then developed into chronic anxiety. Anger was frequently suppressed in families where child anger was seen as disrespect or defiance. Children expressing anger were punished for the emotion itself, regardless of whether the anger was justified. They learned that anger was unacceptable, leading to adults who couldn't access appropriate anger even in situations that warranted it, often developing into passive aggression or explosive anger after years of suppression. Needs and wants were suppressed in families where children were expected to be grateful and undemanding, or where resources were scarce and guilt was used to control children's requests. Children learned that having needs made them burdensome, leading to adults who couldn't ask for help or acknowledge their own needs as legitimate. Research on the long-term consequences of early emotional shutdown paints a disturbing picture. A 2020 longitudinal study published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology followed children who developed early emotional suppression into young adulthood. By age 25, they showed significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety disorders, relationship difficulties, substance abuse, and physical health problems compared to peers who maintained emotional openness. The mechanism appears to be that emotions serve important functions. They signal needs, guide decisions, communicate to others, motivate action. When emotions are suppressed from childhood, all of these functions become impaired. The person loses access to internal guidance systems, struggles to identify their own needs and boundaries, has difficulty forming intimate relationships because intimacy requires emotional transparency, and experiences chronic stress from the cognitive effort of constant suppression. The study found that the earlier the shutdown occurred, the worse the outcomes. Children who suppressed emotions before age 7 showed more severe impairments than those who suppressed starting in adolescence. The critical early years of emotional development had been spent learning suppression rather than healthy expression and regulation. The foundation of emotional intelligence that should have been built during those years was replaced with a foundation of emotional disconnection. Let's examine how school environments contribute to early emotional shutdown. A 2019 study published in School Psychology Review found that many school cultures, particularly those emphasizing discipline, compliance, and academic performance, inadvertently taught children to suppress emotions. Expressions of frustration, sadness, or overwhelm were seen as disruptive or attention-seeking rather than communication of genuine distress. Children learned that school was not a place for emotional authenticity. They learned to hide struggles, to perform competence even when confused or overwhelmed, to suppress anxiety about academic or social challenges. The study found that by third grade, many children had developed a school persona that was emotionally controlled and disconnected from their authentic experience, contributing to the epidemic of childhood anxiety and depression. Teachers with limited training in emotional development often responded to emotional expression with the same dismissive patterns as emotion-dismissive parents. "You're fine. Go back to your seat. We don't have time for this." Or punishing emotional expression with loss of recess or being sent out of class. For children already experiencing emotional invalidation at home, school provided no alternative model of healthy emotional response. Research on cultural factors reveals important variations in how early emotional suppression develops. A 2020 cross-cultural study published in Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology examined emotional socialization across different cultural contexts. They found that cultures varied significantly in which emotions were encouraged versus suppressed, but the pattern of early emotional shutdown in response to invalidation was universal. In collectivist cultures, individual emotional expression that disrupted group harmony was often discouraged from early childhood. In cultures valuing emotional restraint and self-control, children learned early that emotional expression was undignified or immature. In cultures with strong gender role expectations, children learned which emotions were acceptable for their gender and suppressed others. The specific emotions suppressed varied culturally, but the developmental process and long-term consequences were similar. Now, let's talk about what happens when children who learned early emotional suppression become parents themselves. A 2021 intergenerational study published in Development and Psychopathology found that adults who suppressed emotions from childhood often struggled with their own children's emotional expression. They found their children's emotions triggering, overwhelming, or incomprehensible because they'd never learned healthy emotional processing themselves. Many unconsciously replicated the dismissive patterns they'd experienced, telling their children the same invalidating messages they'd heard. "You're fine. Stop crying. Don't be so sensitive." They didn't want to damage their children the way they'd been damaged, but they lacked models of alternative responses. When their child expressed emotion, they didn't know what to do besides suppress it, because that's all they'd learned. Others overcompensated, becoming so focused on validating every emotional expression that they failed to teach appropriate regulation. Their children learned that emotions should always be expressed fully without modulation, leading to different but still problematic emotional development. Breaking the cycle required conscious learning of emotional skills that should have been learned in their own childhood, but weren't. For those watching who recognize that you learned early to stop sharing your feelings, who realize you can trace your emotional suppression back to childhood experiences of invalidation, punishment, or weaponization, I need you to understand something. You were a child. You had no power to change how adults responded to you. The suppression you learned was adaptive survival in an environment where emotional expression felt dangerous. Your child brain did exactly what it needed to do to protect you in that context. But I also need you to understand that what protected you then is limiting you now. The emotional suppression that helped you survive childhood is preventing you from thriving as an adult. You're still operating on neural pathways established when you were 7, 8, 10 years old, pathways that say emotions are dangerous and must be hidden. But you're not that powerless child anymore. The people who invalidated your emotions don't control your current environment. You have agency now to create different patterns. The healing isn't about blaming your parents or caregivers, though acknowledging what happened is important. Many of them were doing the best they could with their own emotional limitations and wounds. But acknowledging that your emotional suppression has roots in childhood experiences allows you to see it not as a fixed personality trait, but as a learned pattern that can be unlearned. This means learning, often for the first time as an adult, what you should have learned as a child, that emotions are information, not threats. That feeling something doesn't mean you have to act on it. That expressing emotions to safe people can create connection rather than danger. that your emotional experiences are valid, even if others don't understand or agree with them. These are things emotionally healthy people learn implicitly through responsive parenting. You're having to learn them explicitly, consciously as an adult. It means finding safe relationships where you can practice emotional expression without the invalidation or punishment you learn to expect. This might be therapy, where a professional is trained to respond to emotions with validation and support. It might be carefully chosen friends who demonstrate emotional maturity and safety. It might be support groups with others who share similar histories. You need repeated experiences of sharing emotions and having them met with acceptance to rewire the neural pathways established in childhood. It means learning to recognize your own emotions, which might be difficult if you've spent decades suppressing them. Emotions don't always present as clear feelings. Sometimes they're physical sensations, tightness in chest, tension in shoulders, heaviness in stomach. Sometimes they're behaviors, irritability, withdrawal, restlessness. Learning to notice these signals and trace them back to emotional sources is detective work that should have happened naturally in childhood, but requires conscious effort as an adult. It means grieving what you didn't receive. You needed caregivers who made space for your emotions, who taught you to understand and express feelings healthily, who responded to your emotional expressions with validation and support. You didn't get that, and that's a legitimate loss. The childhood emotional education you needed didn't happen, and you're having to provide it for yourself as an adult, which is harder and less natural than learning it when your brain was developmentally primed for it. The science is clear. Children who learn early emotional suppression carry those patterns into adulthood, affecting mental health, physical health, relationships, and overall well-being. But the science also shows neuroplasticity means these patterns can change. Your brain remains capable of developing new emotional pathways, learning healthier ways of relating to feelings, building capacity for emotional expression that feels safe. It requires work, discomfort, and time, but it's possible. For those of you who are parents, understanding this research is crucial. Your children's emotional expressions aren't inconveniences or manipulations. They're communication of internal states, opportunities for teaching emotional intelligence, and moments where you shape how your child will relate to their own feelings for the rest of their life. Every time you respond to your child's emotion with validation, you're building neural architecture that will support emotional health. Every time you dismiss, punish, or weaponize their feelings, you're teaching them to suppress. You don't have to be perfect. Parenting is hard, and everyone makes mistakes. But the pattern matters more than any single interaction. Are you generally providing a relationship where emotions are safe to express? Are you teaching your child that feelings are valid and manageable? Are you helping them develop emotional vocabulary and regulation skills? Or are you, consciously or unconsciously, teaching them that emotions are dangerous and must be hidden? The children who are learning right now to suppress their emotions are developing patterns that will affect them for decades. The adults struggling with emotional suppression are living with patterns learned decades ago. But neither group is doomed. Children can be taught that emotions are safe if caregivers learn to respond differently. Adults can learn emotional expression and processing even if childhood didn't provide it. The patterns are powerful, but they're not permanent. The brain can learn new ways of being at any age. The question is whether you're willing to do the uncomfortable work of change.